Well, evening, everyone. So good to see you all again. See you brought a few that must be friends or family friends and never seen them before, but welcome. You're all welcome here. Get yourself something to drink, by golly. Get you some of that popcorn, too. I saw some over there somewhere. Myself, I got some of that chicory coffee. I'm getting used to that. Well, tonight we got a story from one of our listeners, and it looks like a good one. A friend of ours, Sierra, she's from over California way. She lives in the mountains. In fact, she lives in Bigfoot country. We got a ranch out there, and so she sent this story in, and this is awful fun. Now, this is something y'all should be doing. You've got a story, or you know somebody that's got a story, why just write it down and send it in to Ginger, and maybe we'll read this thing on the air. It'd be fun. So get settled, folks, and we'll start in on this. When he first came to the woods, he knew nothing of them. He never planned to end up in a cabin in the mountains, in a place he'd never been to. But one bad divorce later, he found himself sitting in a rocking chair on the porch of an old hand-built cabin deep in the forest. He felt a little nervous about the woods, about this unknown life he was embarking on. See, Jim Connors grew up in the city. He'd never even been to the woods except for one camping trip he took for a field trip when he was 12 years old. He was nervous then, too. But when his sister offered up her cabin as permanent place for him to stay after his messy divorce, his automatic answer was no. Nope, no way, not for me. He shook his head and he scoffed, shooting his sister a look of amusement. But his options were limited, and a month later he found himself settling into his new home in the woods. So there he sat, rocking away, staring at the trees, listening to his sister drone on about her most cheery voice, about how great this was going to be for him. His mind wandered. He wondered what in the world he was going to do out here in the woods to keep from going completely crazy with boredom. Now, their agreement was for him to do some work on the house. But beyond that, what was there? He let his mind play around with humorous ideas. Maybe he'd take up basket weaving, or become a bread-making aficionado, or try growing the biggest carrot ever. So he pictured himself in a pair of overalls, no shirt, hand-woven straw hat, barefoot in the garden, chewing on a piece of plant. He chuckled to himself. His sister could tell he wasn't paying attention. She smacked him in the arm, a big smile across her face. "You're going to like it here. You'll see. You'll be a woodsman before you know it." Jim ruffled his sister's hair. He doubted it. "Howdy," called a voice behind him. Well, they both jumped and looked back, shocked by the unexpected voice. Standing on the porch behind him was a grizzly old man, big, strong, and tall, with a white beard and a face as tough as the old trees around him. "Heard you were my new neighbors," he said in a deep, gravelly voice. He looked like a man who spent his whole life right here in these woods. Yeah," Jim jumped up, throwing out his hand for a handshake. "Jim Connors. Nice to meet you." The old man looked him up and down, withholding any expression from his face. Jim waited, hand out, wondering what the old man was thinking about him. Well, the old man's hesitation was uncomfortable for Jim, but he felt kind of like a fraud, pretending he had what it takes to make it out here in the deep woods. The expressionless pause felt like a glaring agreement of his inadequacy, but slowly, a big old smile filled the old man's face. "Carl," the old man nodded. "Welcome to Pike." See, Pike was an old mining town. You could even call it a town. There was a volunteer fire station, an old schoolhouse, long abandoned. But those were not the only things denoting a town. Mostly, it was large lots of land occupied by people choosing to withdraw from the world around them, or stand against it, or both. It was 40 minutes out of town on a long, windy road, 20 minutes of that weaving up the mountain and into the forest. Pike was deep in the woods, and the people who lived there wanted to be out there. A different way of life than what Jim was accustomed to. He knew he had a lot of figuring out to do now. Carl lived about 10 minutes up the road and was Jim's only real neighbor. Jim's property was nearly 100 acres, surrounded by national forest on all four sides. So besides being far from town and deep in the woods, there was no signs of people anywhere nearby. Heaven to a mountain man like Carl. Hell to a city boy nervous about the woods. Carl looked a little rough around the edges, and Jim imagined probably hard to get to know, but Jim felt a little bit of relief having a solid reminder that he wasn't the only one in these vast woods. Now Carl crossed the porch and grabbed himself a seat. Saw the moving vans a-comin' and going, figured I should come introduce myself. He settled down deeper in his seat, scooting around to get comfy. "I'll take a glass of water, and maybe a snack if you got one," he said as he nodded to Jim's sister. Now she was a bit taken back by his forwardness, but she nodded back and headed inside to retrieve the order. She could hear Carl talking from inside. Turns out he was a talker, going on and on about his property and Pike and its mining history. Jim could hardly get a word in. She chuckled to herself, amused at the thought that her brother would have this guy to keep him company, and happy that he would have somebody. She returned with a plate full of snacks and drinks for everyone, and then the two of them listened to the old man rattle on, sharing knowledge he thought could be helpful to Jim. He seemed to be likable enough, this Carl, and Jim and his sister sat listening well into the evening, when the old man switched his word-weaving to tales of Bigfoot. "Bigfoot," he said, "lives here in the woods among 'em," and then filled the rest of their night with tales of caution and his stories of encountering the hairy large beast. The two listened, amused, skeptical, and sure the old man was probably crazy. Finally, tiredness hit them all, and the old man's talking came to an end. Carl stood, thanked them both for having him, offered to come back by the next day, and disappeared off into the darkness. When Jim began cleaning up, tired, and head swirling from all the listening. He didn't know what to think of his new neighbor. "Well, what do you think of that old guy?" he asked his sister. "Well, he seemed nice enough," she offered up. "He seems like a handy guy to have around. He seems to know a lot." The two of them began to head inside. And she smacked his arm, a smile growing across her face. "And anyways, you're going to need him to protect you from Bigfoot," she said sarcastically, rolling her eyes. Jim laughed out loud. "Yeah, Bigfoot." He scoffed and laughed again, shaking his head. The two went off to bed laughing about Bigfoot, the old man, the fact Jim was going to be living in the woods. The whole thing felt comical, which, for Jim, was a step up from the depression and nervousness he was feeling earlier that day. On the next morning, Jim's sister was leaving. Jim gave her a big old hug and jokingly pled for his sister to take him with her. She joked back, "Let me know if you see any Bigfoot." "Yeah, I'll send pictures," he laughed, shutting her car door. Then, in a dark tone, through the open window, Jim threw in, "If I'm not here when you come back next time, we'll know those Bigfoot stories were real." Jim's sister smiled, rolled her eyes, and drove away. Jim stood there watching the car drive off till it was completely out of sight. He looked around himself. This was the first time he'd been at this cabin alone. He wasn't sure how he felt. He slowly walked back towards the porch, feeling kind of nervous about the unknown in the woods around him. Suddenly his world felt smaller, like everything had just closed in around him. Oh, he had the cabin. That felt safe enough. He knew the cabin, but that was it, for miles. He was stuck in a life of unknowns. He realized he felt uneasy. He started walking faster, knowing he was being silly, but anxious to get back to the safety of his porch. From his porch he could see out around him, but no, there was nothing behind him. He quickly sat down on the porch, scanning the forest in front of him with his eyes. "Howdy!" Jim must have jumped 2 feet out of his chair and startled by the sudden noise. It was that grizzly voice again. Jim jumped up to see Carl standing behind him on the porch. "Where do you keep coming from? I didn't even hear your car," he snapped. Carl moved over to an open chair and sat down. "Decided I'd park a ways down the road and walk in case your sister was on her way out. Didn't want to block her in." "Well, she could have just driven around you," Jim thought to himself as he tried to wash the annoyance off his face. "What's got you so jumpy? You're all worked up," Carl asked him. First time here alone, I guess, Jim sheepishly replied. Well, Carl went on, I knew it was, so I thought I would come check on you and see if you needed help doing anything. Is everything in the cabin working good? Now, Jim, he was 32 years old. He'd spent his whole life in the city. He was sure he had nothing in common with Carl, and he wasn't sure he was up for another day of listening, but he was a little glad to not be alone in the woods, and he did need some help fixing the leaking plumbing. Well, if you don't mind, I could use a little help around here. Simple stuff, really, but I don't know much more than just the basics. How much do you know about plumbing? Jim asked. Carl jumped up and smiled. I'll grab my tools, he said, walking off the porch and off into the woods. Just a short amount of time later, he arrived back in an old pickup truck. He hopped out, grabbing a toolbox from the back end. Now show me your plumbing, he directed, walking past Jim and right on into the house. Awfully forward, thought Jim, following the old man inside. The two then spent the next several hours fixing leaks and replacing pipes until at last the job was done. Jim threw together some lunch for the two of them and they sat down on the porch to eat. He was grateful for the silence as Carl ate, and, he admitted to himself, a little grateful for the company as well. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of crashing branches in the woods. Now, it was a big sound, and whatever was making it certainly was a big creature. Do we get a lot of bears around here? Jim questioned. He immediately felt embarrassed. What a stupid question, he thought to himself. Of course there's a lot of bears. We're in the woods. Bigfoot, Carl nonchalantly replied, and went on eating his sandwich like he was talking about something common, like a squirrel. Jim chuckled to himself and rolled his eyes. He wanted to know what this bear was up to, not about some cryptid. Well, that didn't even exist. He was about to push on about the bear, but instead blurted out, You don't really believe all that Bigfoot hubbub, do you? Carl stopped eating, put down his sandwich, and he got up. Jim was sure he was going to just walk off offended, but he didn't. He walked to the edge of the porch, placed his hands on the rail, and let out a big, deep sigh. Either he's real, or I'm a liar, Carl said in an eerie voice, his mind clearly in some distant memory, one he wasn't fond of remembering. You know, Jim, believe what you want to believe. I'm not going to tell you Bigfoot's real. You'll figure that out for yourself. But I will tell you, be careful. I'm not saying he's going to eat you, but I will tell you there have been some in these parts that have randomly gone missing. He walked back to his chair and he grabbed his hat. I guess I'll be off now. Seems I'm a little tired out, he said in a somber voice. Whatever memory he had gone back to had knocked him down a few notches, and Jim thought it better to let him be there alone. He silently watched Carl walk away. It wasn't until later that night that Jim actually thought about the words Carl had spoken. He didn't quite know if the old man had shown fear or sadness or caution. Perhaps it was all of those. Either way, the old man had shown he believed in Bigfoot. He went to bed feeling sorry for the old guy, for whatever had happened that could bring that old tough man down to nothing. Now, that night Jim was awoken by a commotion outside. As he lay there nervously listening, he could hear whatever it was rustling outside on what sounded like the porch. There was banging and crashing and the sound of the furniture being scooted. There was a loud scratching noise that echoed through the woods. Jim didn't know what to do. He wanted to lay there in the safety of his bed upstairs and just wait for what he could only guess was a bear to leave. But he didn't want this bear coming back. He jumped out of bed and he started down the stairs. How do you even scare a bear? Do bears even get scared? He ran down the stairs, making a point to stomp as loud as he could. He threw on the porch light and it went silent. All that noise just came to a stop. Jim ran to the window to see if the bear was still out there. There was no sign of the bear, not on the porch, not in the yard, not running back to the woods. It was gone, whatever it was. He looked at the porch. Table overturned, chairs thrown off the porch or broken in two. And this wasn't light furniture. These things were made of big, thick, sturdy pieces of wood. They were heavy and they were big. He wondered how a bear could pick up and throw one of those chairs over the railing, and how could it just disappear so quickly. It took him all of 2 seconds to get from the bottom of the stairs to the light and then the window. Shouldn't he have seen it running back to the woods? He turned to go back inside. The door was covered in deep gouges. Whatever it was had been trying to get inside. That scratching noise he had heard, was it trying to scratch its way inside? Jim shuddered. This cabin was his only sense of safety in this whole area. The idea that it couldn't keep him safe was almost too much for him to handle. He went inside and he sat down on a chair to breathe and regroup. After a few moments, he carried himself back up to bed and tried to fall back asleep. Sleep must have found him, because the next thing he knew, the sun was pouring in on him, waking him with a warmth and a light radiating around the room. For a moment, he questioned whether it was all just a bad dream. But he knew it had been real, no matter how much he wished it wasn't. He went downstairs to survey the damage in the light. "Howdy," came the grizzled voice as Jim walked out onto the porch. Again, he jumped. It was almost creepy, this old man. "Had a little Bigfoot activity at my place last night. Thought I'd come check, see how you fared. Seems you did as well." The old man went over and grabbed the edge of the overturned table and waited, looking for Jim to help. Jim shook his head to clear his thoughts and walked over to help pick the table back up. "It's weird to me that the bear would even be trying to get in here. There hasn't been food here for so long. Why would it even think this is a place it could come to get food?" Jim pondered. "It wasn't a bear, Jim," Carl said very matter-of-factly. Jim, tired from last night's excitement and feeling a little frightened, snapped at the old man. "Enough, Carl. Enough of this Bigfoot stuff. What I need to know is, how do you get rid of a bear?" Carl walked over to the overturned chair, grabbed his side, and looked up at Jim with a nod, asking for help. Jim grabbed the other side of the chair, and the two of them flipped it. "Have a seat, and let me tell you a story, Jim." Jim was just a little annoyed by Carl's nonchalance. If he wasn't even alarmed by this whole big mess, did that mean bears overturning giant log furniture and trying to claw through doors was a regular, no-big-deal thing around here? He walked past Carl and went inside to pour himself a cup of coffee. When he returned, Carl was patiently waiting, calm as the woods around him. He tried again. "Sit down, Jim. Let me tell you a story." Well, Jim reluctantly sat down, not sure he wanted to hear this story Carl was about to tell. But Carl shifted in his seat and began. "I'm not the only one around here that believes in Bigfoot, Jim. Many of us have seen him, some haven't, but have been dealing with the havoc he raises, and there's probably still a few like you that refuse to believe even when the signs are right in front of him." Now it was Jim shifting in his chair. "Let me tell you how I came to believe Bigfoot was real," Carl went on. "I first came here with my wife, many years back. Too many to count, really. Anyway, we started out like you, unsure. Others in this area would tell us about him, but we weren't going to believe anything we couldn't see for ourselves. Then we started hearing the crashing branches and movement in the woods. We didn't know then that was Bigfoot watching us. We thought it was a bear, just like you. Pretty soon after we started to hear the sounds, the Bigfoot cries in the woods, we began to feel like we were always being watched. Then one evening, he came into the place while we were gone. Just tore the kitchen apart. The weird thing was the fur he left behind. It was golden colored, not black like the bears around here. And that's when we begun to wonder. After that, the weird stuff began to happen. Weird stuff. Like one day when our clothes were hanging to dry, he came and took all my wife's clothes off the clothesline. Then her stuff started disappearing from the house. One night while we were sleeping and there was a crashing noise, I woke up and there was the hairy beast standing above us. His big black eyes and sharp teeth. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I let out a yell, not sure what I was going to do, but it turned around and he left. I was shocked. My wife woke up at my yelling, but she hadn't seen him. Now I knew then that I needed to make our house Bigfoot proof so he couldn't get back in. And in doing so, not make my wife nervous. And in the meantime, And my wife, thinking that leaving food out at the edge of the forest every night, thinking that that would keep the Bigfoot from coming into the house. But he started coming just when she was home. When I was there, silence. Never any movement in the woods. And when she was there by herself, she was always hearing things. Her stuff would still go missing too. At first I just figured it was 'cause she was feeding him. I thought of course he was coming around when she was there. He wanted more food. But then one night, I woke to her screaming. The Bigfoot was above her, grabbing her to pull her from the bed. I jumped out of bed and grabbed whatever I could reach to hit him with. I repeatedly swung at him with the lamp with all my might, screaming and beating him until at last he dropped her and ran off. Jim's eyes grew big and a disturbed look grew on his face. And that's when I knew it wasn't the food he wanted. It was her. The next day we got heavy locks for the doors and window shutters and called realtors about selling our place. We made arrangements for my wife to leave. And then it happened. That awful night. A look of horror mixed with sadness filled Carl's face. That night, he came back for her, and he wasn't going to go without her. He clawed through the door. I battled the beast. I gave him everything I had, but it wasn't enough. He grabbed her, and I watched him carry her off through the darkness and into the woods. I tried to run after, but I couldn't keep up. She was gone. I stayed, hoping she'd find her way back home, but she never did. Carl shook his head. Jesus, Carl, are you freaking kidding me? Jim jumped up. Are you for real? Jim paced back and forth, markedly disturbed. And you're just now telling me this? You didn't mention any of that the other night, Jim screeched. Carl got up, put his hand on Jim's shoulder, and looked him in the eye. Calm down, Jim. I'm just yanking your chain. Carl chuckled to himself. Bigfoot's real, but my story ain't. Just thought I'd give you a jostle. I haven't ever been married, Jim. Never been able to find one wanting to stick around. Carl put his other hand on Jim's other shoulder. You look scared out of your mind. Sorry, Jim. Just having a little fun. Jim shook loose of Carl's grip and took a step backwards, shaking his head. Jim let out a big breath. I'm not sure that's my idea of fun, he said in a sulky voice. You really had me going, Carl. Don't do that to me. I'm not cut out for these woods enough as it is. Jim turned around and headed towards the door. It's no wonder you couldn't find a lady to stick around. You got a poor sense of humor. Jim shot back with a half smile. I'll see you tomorrow, Carl. Jim walked inside. He felt just a little weirded out by Carl's story and by Carl. He didn't even really know the guy, and after that he wasn't sure he really wanted to. Jim hopped into the shower to try to wash off the uneasiness he was feeling. Then he turned on his TV, for the first time since arriving, to try to get his mind on something else. A few hours later, Jim began to feel back to normal. He thought back to the original commotion that morning. Now, whether it was a Bigfoot or a bear, he had a mess to clean up, he thought to himself. And he went out to clean up the broken chair. And as he walked out, he noticed his world seemed a little bigger and a little lighter. The woods seemed a little less threatening. He guessed nothing was quite as bad as the old man's story. For the first time, he felt slightly less nervous about the woods. Whatever Bigfoot or bear was out there, at least it wasn't the one from Carl's story. He wasn't quite ready to go explore the woods, but he felt like maybe spending the rest of the day outside in the yard. There was an old storage shed threatening to fall down next to the house, and Jim thought it was as good a time as any to tackle that project. It was early afternoon, so he had several hours before dusk to finish up. It wasn't long after Jim had begun that he started to hear knocks echoing from the woods. The sound of wood hitting wood. That's weird, thought Jim, listening harder. He'd heard Carl's stories of Bigfoot knocking in the woods. This time, though, he didn't jump straight to doubt, but he still didn't believe it was Bigfoot. He pondered what it might be that made that noise as he returned to work. He didn't know, but it really didn't worry him. Jim worked into the evening, then went to bed early, feeling proud that he actually did manage to fix the shed. As he laid in bed, he could hear noises in the trees through the open window, sounds of twigs crunching and tree branches swishing and branches breaking. little sounds and big sounds. Well, he thought to himself, I guess there's bound to be animals out there. It is, after all, the woods. Not every noise is going to be a Bigfoot or a bear, he assured himself, and with that, he was able to drift off to sleep. Now, he'd been asleep for hours when the banging coming from downstairs woke him up. He sat up in bed and listened to the smashing going on downstairs. Jim jumped up out of bed and into the hall, throwing the stairway light on. Immediately, silence. Jim ran down the stairs. Nothing. He ran outside. No sign of anything. He listened. There were no noises coming from the woods. Now he wondered why he didn't see or hear it run off. He hurried back inside to survey the damage. It had opened the door of the refrigerator, pulled some food out, knocked the jars off the counter, and a few of the cupboards were open. No real damage, just a mess to clean up. And he put the untouched food items back away and decided to save the rest of the cleanup for morning. Well, there you go, folks. Pretty good little story. Thank you, Sierra. Now, what would you do if you woke up to that kind of noise and a mess in your kitchen? You couldn't explain it. Would you be able to go back to sleep? Yeah, I don't think I would. Not that night, anyway. Well, that gives you something to think about. Folks, I'm glad you were here with us tonight. That was fun. And we got more stories right around the corner. We probably got a few more tonight. And if not tonight, we've got definitely some tomorrow night. So come on back. We'll tell some more stories and enjoy each other's company. Until I see you again, this is Clay Steele. Good night.